Okay, here we go. Hello, good morning. Today is June 16th, 2021, and we are having our SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting. Today, we're in a good streak of meetings and good agenda items. So we have a couple of items that we carried forward from last meeting. So let's start with those. Vivek, do you want to recap and pick it up?
Sure. So I think the last meeting, I couldn't explain properly what the namespace quota is designed to do. So just to give you guys a brief idea, the idea is to like etcd does not have like a storage isolation mechanism right now, wherein every customer is just the same. So everyone can fill up the space as in how they want. And the kind of problem is that when you have a multi-tenant cluster where like Kubernetes is one of the clients and other people are other clients, you want some storage isolation for each client that you're using that's using etcd. So this is kind of there to introduce that kind of mechanism in etcd. How does this affect Kubernetes? So the idea is that Kubernetes needs to like track storage on different resources, different namespaces, just different items in Kubernetes itself. So this can be used for that, wherein like Kubernetes can be like, oh, how much storage is the pod using itself, or all of the pods, or maybe a namespace, how much storage is the namespace using. Currently, I think it's lacking, went through the fairness and API, fairness and priority usage policies, and it's still like, it's kind of lacking that. So this feature is angled towards that, where like everyone can track how much storage Kubernetes is using in general and kind of report back. So there's a document, there's a proposal on how this is implemented within etcd and what changes are coming through. Yeah, so just to kind of get it out there to the community and see what they have to say, what their idea is, what their take is.
I'll say I think it's fine if the system administrator wants to configure this. I don't actually think it's a good idea to share a cluster between Kubernetes and something else, because a cluster is already like using basically all the capacity from etcd that there is. So I definitely wouldn't recommend it, but if people want to do that, I mean, I'm not going to stop them. I don't think that we would want Kubernetes to configure and use this feature for itself, like to confine namespaces or something. We already have a quota mechanism. The priority and fairness is not the quota mechanism for storage. That's for requests, which, you know, a request and the amount of data stored is just different things. We have the quota right now. There's an object count quota. One quota that we are missing is a like aggregate size quota, and the reason we don't have that is that it's hard to predict what size an object will be after it's gone through all of our various steps in the process. I'm not excited about having etcd itself be the quota enforcement, just because like in the past, we've had problems where like API server had a wrong estimate of the object size, and then API server admitted the request, but etcd rejected it. And like that, just API server is not set up to expect that, and it caused a lot of problems. So I'm not very excited about having the possibility where API server could let a request go through and then etcd rejects it. Like, right, like that makes it very hard for the end user to fix it. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
That could happen for other reasons too, and we do have to kind of be resilient to it in some fashion. I understand what you mean in that one. It was weird because it was like the moment you started saying that, Daniel, I was like, oh, I like this better than our object count quota system, which is a bit of a hack. It's not a hack. Let's say it's a carefully crafted, simplistic possible system. Something more principled at a lower level or something more powerful at a lower level has some advantages. It might complicate, like, you know, object count quota is an API we have to keep supporting. Is it really worth the complexity of separating out object quota and passing it down to etcd? That complexity would worry me a bit. Although I have to admit, you know, the vast majority of all tenancy in every kube cluster is namespace tenancy. And so, you know, from a practical perspective, like what are the knobs that people turn? And they turn resource quota, they turn limit range. But then the tools kind of end there, and it's a wild west, or go build your own. If we had a little bit more principled of a lower level, and then we were focused maybe more on, you know, empowering some of that other, you know, balancing and fairness. And you're right that priority and fairness have some overlap the higher up you get. It is a lot of change. That was the word for me, is like, it's a lot of change. Does it actually make something better? If we could just use both together and someone could bring that in if they wanted to, that has some advantages. Like, look, if you want to do this, do it. It's, you know, you need to make sure Cube deals with it well. Like I could, Daniel, maybe to your point about like the 2 layers, is I do think Cube should react well to etcd errors. That's part of the storage layer's responsibility. So say there was a specific type of error and translating that to a Cube API error and telling the user what that means, like I could buy that argument.
There's also like if you start getting quota errors, like for a namespace, like you could break a lot of stuff about the cluster, right? Like a bunch of automated stuff, like your pods can't record statuses anymore. It's a pretty serious failure when there's like an entire class of things that can't be written.
Yeah, well, some of the risk is.
Sorry, go ahead.
Some of the risk is that, like, when you go to delete something, you actually issue an update to etcd and add a finalizer so the object gets bigger. But from a practical level, our etcd keys are organized first by resource, then by namespace. So if I wanted to cap the size of a particular namespace, is the etcd quota flexible enough to say, like, I want these n key ranges summed together, or is it like it has to be this contiguous range?
It's sort of like a contiguous range right now, where like you can think of it as a directory, where like I just cap the directory by saying /a is limited to like 500 gigabytes or something, and then what you put in is like kind of oblivious to etcd. Like we don't really care what's in it. It's just the 500 gigs is the hard limit.
Yeah, what that means is that we can't use it to cap namespaces. We could use it to cap certain resources in namespaces, but we couldn't do something like the total of your pods, config maps, and secrets cannot exceed 100 megs. We can't describe that because it's in 3 different key ranges.
Got it. Yeah, but it's just maybe there's like more I can do. It's just a feedback right now. Like it's just a technical doc. So maybe we can like kind of figure something out. But the idea is that like, it's like this error is just like any other error where like, I think you were talking about the update. So the update's like, oh, if you're trying to update something, that's okay. Like it does go through, like the design is kind of resilient, that kind of stuff where like, oh, we understand you're trying to delete or just update something. And if the size is going down, then that's okay. But technically we're trying to limit, like the final problem we're trying to solve is like, we just want some storage kind of definition of what storage means to like each customer that we're providing in etcd. And Cube is one of the biggest ones for sure. It's just that like the other guys who are there, like they just need a little bit of space, and then Kubernetes chews through a lot of stuff. So it's just the idea of providing a little bit of isolation with like what we can do best and kind of still maintain like the Kubernetes operations just like unaffected sort of. So yeah, I get like it's going to break a lot of stuff, but we can kind of accommodate and then kind of move forward rather than just like, oh, this is how we want to do it. This is just a feedback.
So I think a couple of concrete things that we've come up with are if you actually bump into the size and then you try to delete a pod, for instance, that pod will actually have its object size grow before it's deleted. So a Cube API action of delete requires an update action that might make the pod 20 bytes bigger, right? And then during the process of deletion, it will get more updates that make that another 100 bytes bigger before it finally gets removed. And the Cube API server knows its semantics, so it knows that's happening and can accommodate it. I don't know that I see how etcd does, but I think before it can be recommended, even for people to turn on of their own accord, there needs to be some sort of explanation for how that would work. And then the idea of limiting the size of a namespace overall bumps into the key space issue that I described, where we actually use multiple key spaces to represent a single namespace.
Yeah, I will note though, like we had that problem on deletion today. Deletion can result in objects that are a lot larger for other reasons. So it's just, it makes it much more likely. And so I think David's point's fair. I did want to highlight, like, there is no difference between a delete and an update. Normal operation failing for update was kind of Daniel's concern. So even though delete grows, like regular updates failing would confuse the kubelet, deletes failing would confuse the kubelet. And then there is an argument that that could still happen today. And so the other thing I might say is it's a bug on Cube if you can't go and delete an object by clearing finalizers directly. So there is an angle, like if we can, you know, if this goes and gets done and there's something we can test, like that's a reasonable bug to accept on Cube, which is an administrator in this scenario must be able to physically delete the etcd object in a reasonable way, even if maybe that's not the API.
Yeah, okay, we should probably time box this, but yes, absolutely, you can have this happen today, and it is disastrous.
Sorry, I work with Vivek, and may I also add one more thing is that initially, you know, if we're going to do this, is going to be a warning on the etcd side. So really, it's not going to be an error right away, and like the error is like something like very drastic. So most likely it's going to be a warning for, you know, administrator of etcd cluster to go like check with the you know, cube to see, okay, what's up, what's going on, right? So that's like the first use case, and the error is you know, it's going to be some, you know, it's going to be issued only when it's like, okay, this is really bad, right? And like you know, so yeah, just to clarify that part.
Yeah, it's like there are multiple modes to run this. Like you don't have to like directly go all in and say like just error out when you exceed the quota. Just give me a warning and then I'll see what to do. Like the admin can then decide where to go from here on. So it's there's a step in between, like going from 0 to 100 like directly.
Okay. We should probably go on to the next topic. Thank you very much. Chao or Howie?
Chao and Howie, yes.
Okay, so I want to discuss a little bit about the storage version migrator. The question I asked in the notes is, shall we keep investing on this project? I saw David's comments below, so it seems David is still positive on keep investing. So I guess then my purpose is just to reaffirm what our goals are with this project. And
can I just chime in briefly? I didn't see this before, but I do have colleagues that use this thing and would be sad to see it go.
That's nice. Sorry, who's speaking?
This is Mike Spreitzer from IBM. We use it.
Okay, nice. Okay, great. So there are two different type of resources storage migrator cares about. For one is the built-in resources, and the other one is the CRDs. Shall I do a very brief introduction on the storage version migrator?
Okay. If we're trying to time box the 10 minutes, I guess maybe just go to the level of on request, it can do a read-write cycle of an entire type of resource, and that in effect can update it to have the storage, the data that's stored be in a different version. That's what its purpose is, right?
Right. So it's going to get the data in the SED updated to the latest storage version. That's its functionality. So for built-in resources, currently, because we don't have the storage version migrator, we have to keep all the deprecated types toggle and the deprecated versions conversion code in the codebase, in the Kubernetes codebase. But it seems that people are fine with this. So I'm wondering, let's say if we get storage version migrator to a GA state, what will our next steps be? Will we go ahead, delete all the deprecated types.go and the conversion logic is this desired?
It's a thing that I desire because right now, if you have an old version that you're transforming from, it becomes impossible to remove inert fields. And it's also impossible to make certain fields that have always been defaulted required. And those two things, if you dropped the old types, you would be able to change. I do think that we could try to bound the problem of the storage version migrator rather than have it try to automatically detect when a storage migration is appropriate. We can try to call the project complete once we have confidence that the API that does the I request a read write cycle provides enough building blocks for people to work on top of it, right? Most of the uses I've seen have been people externally calling it once they know, say, their new CRD conversion webhook is present, they'll convert everything. And then they can remove the old version.
Yeah, that's our use case, for example.
Yeah, I think what would be helpful for me is just what is the list of things that need to be done to get it to GA level, right? Like I think people use it and it is useful, and there's a need in the system. Like even if you don't want to deprecate and actually remove, or even if you don't want to actually remove deprecated things, like it's still useful to have the storage version be a good storage version, like a modern storage version. So yeah, I think it's useful. The question is just how much effort remains, and like if we had a good list, maybe we could get some volunteers to finish it off.
Okay, yeah, I think what David suggests makes the remaining effort much smaller. So because currently we're still working on some automation API, but if that's not the goal, then if that's just about the migration API, then we can quickly move forward.
Yeah, I think that'd be cool to like get what we have to a GA state, and then the automatic triggering can be a separate follow-on effort.
Okay, that's a good suggestion.
So one of the names that I listed there is Luis Sanchez. He is on leave for a little while. I think he's back in July. Can I have him get up with you when he gets back and bring him in this conversation as well? He's
sure.
On our side, the person who's been actually using it. Thank you.
Sure.
But continue on. Tim, I see you're on the call. Do you want me to introduce this topic, or do you want me to introduce it?
I can give a brief introduction. So this came out of an outage review that my team handled when an admission controller that we manage, the certificate was updated accidentally, and then when that change rolled out, it broke the cluster because suddenly the API server could no longer talk to the webhook backend. So I was thinking about how we could build in a safer rollout procedure so that a mistake like this wouldn't break the entire cluster when it happened. I shared some ideas here that we can talk about in more detail. Another question that I wanted to kind of raise as part of this, this was specifically looking at validating webhook configurations, but I think this kind of idea would apply to any cluster scoped resources. It's just that a broken admission webhook is more likely to break the cluster completely than some other changes to cluster scoped resources. So I don't know if you want to bound this conversation to specifically the admission webhooks or.
Well, no, I think I think we've discussed some related topics before, and I don't know that anybody has had an amazing idea about how to solve this. I think the problem is actually pretty broad.
Well, I thought Tim was coming to us with an amazing idea. But before Daniel talks about like the other attempts, do you actually have a concrete idea, Tim?
Not exactly. So there were some ideas. I guess what I wrote up here was thinking about staging the rollout different namespaces. So if we had sort of a controller on webhook configurations, then you could say, send admission reviews for certain namespaces to some set of, or I guess to be able to kind of gradually roll out the changes to different namespaces. This only applies for webhooks that apply to namespace resources. So there
are we building in Launch Darkly? Are we building in Launch Darkly? Do we need to?
I don't know what that is.
I don't know what that means. Yeah, and I'm trying to think of related APIs.
Yeah, and it's not exactly the same, but Launch Darkly is this service that anyone running anything can subscribe to it. That they think of it as feature flags. So you have control over what feature flag is turned on in what context, and that's kind of like this, except that's the binary version, and this is like, instead of binary, we're doing integers or something like that. But it's conceptually a very similar kind of thing.
I think it's a little bit more complicated than just like, is this webhook working or not? Because I feel like there's a fundamental tension between keeping the cluster available and keeping the policies enforced. And the people who are interested in keeping the policies enforced would rather crash the cluster than have requests go through that are bypassing policies. And the people who want the cluster to stay available would rather have if the webhook isn't working, let's turn it off. And there's kind of a fundamental tension between these two groups. And I see it as an arms race between these people. And at the moment, I think the policy side is winning because it's easy to stop your entire cluster with a bad webhook. The problem is it's very difficult to tell the difference between a webhook that is incorrectly blocking requests and a webhook that is correctly blocking requests. So I am not quite sure that I've heard anyone articulate a good middle ground between these two camps.
Well, I think Tim's idea is a little bit different.
Yeah, is our job to pick one middle ground or offer the ability for a given cluster to be configured in the appropriate way for that cluster?
I mean, it's a good question. I don't know if I would necessarily see it in this. Like we could say, like, we already let you configure your cluster however you like, and that's great as long as your configuration is perfect and your webhooks never go down. I think, which I think is equivalent to taking the position of security is the most important thing.
We do already offer a failure policy. So I think to some degree, we already offer the ability for someone to say, it's more important for this to crash my cluster. And that's what failure policy fail means. And if it's more important to be available, I can make it fail open. But I do think, Daniel, Tim presented a new idea where the failure policy is still honored, but you somehow use two configurations, which is a thing we don't have today. Right? If I've understood correctly, that's what you're proposing, Tim?
Yeah. So one thing to clarify here, changes to the back end, the thing that's actually serving the webhook is a separate issue. And to some extent, like if you're running your webhook in the cluster, hosting it in the cluster, then you can already do this today with a deployment and setting a good rollout strategy on that. So that's like if you're changing the policy, changing what pods are allowed or not, I would expect that to go out as part of the changes to the actual deployment serving the webhook. So this is specifically for that like webhook configuration piece. So the example I gave earlier was a change to the certificate that caused the API server to no longer be able to communicate with the backend. So that actually would, I think it's pretty easy to separate a failure to connect there, like the certificate validation failure is separate from an admission rejection.
I mean, I can imagine a couple things we could do there. Like you could already today, just instead of modifying in place your webhook configuration, duplicate it with the change name or something and a failure policy fail open, and call your webhook twice, once with the old and once with the new configuration, and verify that your configuration is working. That's something you could do today. If we wanted to get fancier than that, then and like kind of automate every change this way, then the API object itself would have to like have a trial or right, like an experimentation thing, and remember the last setting and the current setting. I don't know. Typically, if we're going to do something like that, it'd be structured like deployments and replica sets or something like that, where like a change causes it to create like we'd make a webhook configuration canary object and controller, which would basically do the thing that I just described. Since your webhooks should be stateless and it should be fine to and idempotent and side effect free, it should be fine to call it multiple times. I don't know.
The idea of putting a second.
Yeah, go ahead. I guess, yeah, I agree with you, Daniel. I think that you could approximate a lot of this today with either duplicating the webhook with a fail open policy, or getting creative with the match namespaces and match resources labels. And probably we could even build a third-party controller fairly easily that would automate some of this rollout.
I would actually say, like, even if we think we wanted to build some feature like this into upstream Kubernetes, it would be good to experiment with the general approach with controllers and extensions, etc. Just so that we does it actually help? Does it catch things? Yeah.
One thing that was interesting to me when you described it here, Tim, was that you talked about doing it per namespace, not per API server. And I guess that's because you want to handle cases where it's not an HA cluster. Is that one of the reasons for doing it that way?
Want to be able to handle it for a non-HA cluster, but also to have some consistency requests. So this, if you're changing the policy, You don't want like a non-deterministic policy decision there.
Okay,
I
so
think I think both of those are not good bucketing mechanisms, because you can have a hot API server. You could also have a hot namespace, right? Like, so like you do all the namespaces that have 0 work, and those tell you almost nothing about the namespace that's really important to you. I think it might be better to like hash some fact about the request and send, like, make sure that you're sending like approximately 1% of your traffic or something like that, if we were going to have a canary test. Now that might actually be reasonable to add to the API object, right? Like you could imagine a policy, you want it to call the webhooks, but you're basically testing it. So you could ask it to send like 1% of traffic through the webhook, and then you could dial that up or down with an external controller. That might be something that's reasonable. I think in an HA cluster, without a bunch of work, you wouldn't necessarily be guaranteed that every API server has a scene exactly the same version of the webhooks, right? Like we don't currently synchronize that between them. So if you want policy consistency, you may have to wait like 10 seconds, 30 seconds or something for the API servers to have all seen the latest version of webhooks. Hopefully that's okay.
It would probably be a best practice to not roll out changes to the webhook configuration at the same time that you're rolling out like a new backend image or like policy configuration. So maybe the consistency becomes a little less important with that if you're assuming that there aren't any policy changes happening. I guess the one exception would be if you're changing the rules to what requests get sent to the webhook.
Yeah, actually, the more I think about it, the more I like the idea of like just a traffic percentage slider, where API server hashes the easy to compute aspects of the requests and decides, is that mod 100, is that larger or smaller than your percentage, and if so, send it to the webhook. Otherwise, skip it. That seems pretty useful to me without like trying to solve the whole problem. It seems tractable. I don't know. What do you think, David?
I think if you did that, if you offered that feature and you said for well-behaved webhooks that can be called twice, you can create a second instance of the webhook configuration to test or change.
Yeah.
That probably gives you sufficient building blocks to have a good way of doing it without just instantly crushing your webhook. I think the slider is important. 1% might not be enough in small clusters.
Yeah, exactly. I think also you might want to specify like greater than or less than, so you could do a split. Like this webhook sends, so you could be guaranteed, or maybe just a range. So you could split traffic between 2 versions of the webhook rather than duplicating all traffic to both webhooks, if that makes sense.
Maybe I am not a fan of the idea of having an API server try to remember a previous state of an existing webhook.
No. Yeah, I agree. Okay. That's not what I was saying.
So the idea would be then that I could create a duplicate admission webhook configuration, and I have one take everything after all the other 99% and one take the 1%.
Yeah.
Why would I want that in this case? Just to fail.
Yeah, I think it makes more sense if you want a 50-50 traffic split.
But why would I want that split, I guess is.
Why isn't 1% good enough? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, 1%. Yeah, who cares if you duplicate work on 1% of your requests? But usually people stage rollouts in more than like more than 2 groups, right? Like you don't. I mean, for some installations, it'd be fine to go from 1% to then 100%. For other situations, you might want to go 0.1% to 1% to 10% and then to everything.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at it saying that most of the time when I think of trying to do a fully staged up like A/B and shift over, it's because I'm replacing the image that is serving the same webhook configuration. The bits of information available in the webhook configuration itself tend to be things that I either want on or off, right? Like I might be changing a namespace selector, or I might be changing like the resources and verbs, and those don't tend to be things where I want to, phase and switch off. I think they're things like, if it works, great, let's switch.
Yeah, Tim brought up the cert data.
Yeah, that doesn't look like I mean, maybe it is, but I wouldn't have expected that to be a sort of scale up and gracefully switch over. I would expect that to be like, okay, this configuration works, switch.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I guess it's your use case, Tim. Like, did you wish you had a way to say like bring it up in stages, or just want to see, does it work? Yep.
Yeah, I guess in our case it was an all or nothing failure. Yeah, if we had rolled that out to 1% of traffic, seen that it works, and then gone to 100, that would have been fine.
I think we currently don't write anything back to the status of webhooks. Maybe we should consider doing that, like just extremely basic stats, because right now it's kind of difficult to discover. Like if we did let you like send 1% of your traffic to a webhook configuration just to test it, it would be kind of difficult for you to tell if those requests were actually failing, right?
How would
we don't
this
make
be?
it super easy to discover.
So you're saying choose a selection of the metrics and find a way to post that in status?
Yeah, something like that.
That gets a little complicated with HA servers. I'm not against the idea.
Yeah, it does. It does. You either have to be like pretty careful about like transactionally decrementing your memory and incrementing the object, or you just have to report status from each API server separately.
I'm open to the idea. I think that's interesting to be able to report a percentage of probably admission, accept or reject, and connection failure modes.
Yeah.
That'd be interesting to see.
Don't think
actually reporting it separately from each API server could be pretty interesting in case there's a connectivity problem from one particular API server.
And what's noteworthy about the unique, so what's interesting about it is that you could use this to inform a controller if you wrote it into API status.
Controllers can reach lots of services. Controllers could ping metrics too. I mean, like, I agree in the sense of, yes, this could be useful. I would say this is something we have explicitly rejected doing in other places, which is frequently changing numerical values that are metrics belong to metric systems, not to status objects.
Frequently might be in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, and I mean, again, like, because you're basically just writing a crappy service mesh at this point, right? Like everything we've just discussed here is like a very, very stripped down, bare bones, crappy service mesh. And maybe like, and again, like that, sometimes that's useful for very fundamental capabilities. It has a pretty high bar for going too far on it.
So I'm putting myself in the shoes of, or trying to put myself in the shoes of, I'm Tim, and I've just had to answer this terrible call about why my webhook went down, and I want to write a controller to manage it. And what data is missing for him to write the controller.
What's he
himself.
managing? Sorry, he's actively managing the percentage of traffic via a spec field on a webhook endpoint.
I believe the choice overall is trying to roll out a new CA bundle for an admission webhook. And the method is by creating a duplicate of that admission configuration, having it with a fail open policy, and redirecting a percentage of traffic to it. And once he does that, he needs to make a decision about whether this is working well or not working well. And it is possible to say, well, Tim, now you need to go integrate with your metric system and work with that to get the answer. Or we could say on a every 10-minute basis, an API server will write out basic stats. And now he watches the whole resource.
There's ways of compressing it so that you don't have to change it frequently. Like you could,
sure, but
you could bucket it and do percentage, right? Like
effectively though, what we're saying is that the Webhook API is misdesigned for deployment, and we need additional sets of things. I'm not disagreeing that like you itself is the wrong API, and there should be, like, we can look at ways of modeling the Webhook API differently that would let it. I understand what you're describing, and I feel like that starts to cross into you're taking a bunch of ideas from a bunch of different systems and putting them into a cube object. And historically, when I've said that, I'd be like, that feels like something that we would solve with the right system behind it, so that it's somebody else's problem, like a webhook proxy that is responsible for managing all of that under the covers, and it's not the responsibility of the Kube API server. Like, you could run a proxy for webhooks that has one set of credentials in the front end and manage them back end. It's kind of a special case though, right? Because you do need to rotate that cert bundle eventually. So I understand the use case being novel.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it would be a relatively simple change to do this. And if you're trying to manage this, like, I think it is very reasonable for status to tell you, like, is this thing working or not? Like, have we sent any requests to this webhook? Yes or no? Of those requests, have any succeeded? Yes or no?
Summarization, absolutely, I agree with. Metrics, no. So if you can frame this as a summarization problem, I totally agree, right? Like, we already summarize status. So that part, yes, it's just not metrics.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be metrics. I like, you could bucket it into, like, exponential buckets of, like, have you sent how many requests have we sent to this webhook? Like, none, some, lots, extreme, right? Like,
well, as long as one request passes, like, haven't you already checked the certificate at that point? Maybe that's the question I'm asking. Is, like, the certificate bundle, it's like, it works or it doesn't? In
our experience managing API services more than admission webhooks, we found that one isn't enough and 5 is too many. But a lot depends on where they're from, right? When you're trying to decide, is this good or is this bad? Being able to have the individual API servers give you an indication is significantly valuable. Like, imagine Stefan dealing with the problems of, like, why can't this one Kube API server contact that one API service? And this looks very similar.
I think a single request working tells you that there's at least one backing instance of the webhook which is configured correctly, but it doesn't tell you.
That analogy is very useful, right? Like, API service is the same as webhook config, which is roughly the same thing as what our EDE tests have to do to make sure the config change is propagated on all 3 API servers when you're running an HA-based server configuration, which today you can't actually tell without doing probabilistic checking of, hey, does the thing the load balancer routed me to have this CRD yet, or API service is not, which is a set of bugs. And, like, Jordan and I have been working with a couple people. So there are 3 things that are similar here, which is, I'm talking through a load balancer to a bit of the Kube infrastructure. Do we have a condition or a summarization that accurately indicates that all of them have ratcheted? And there might be 3 different approaches, but, like, that to me is a reason to go do it. if we could find the thing that's relatively common enough, or the thing that's common if it's common, or something that we can align to API service and webhook equally.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm looking at Tim's message just now. I could think of other ways to do it, which is like, maybe we could let users specify a header or something on a request that's like, definitely send this request to some webhook. And then you could make a webhook that doesn't select things and test it selectively with requests. Regardless of the network layer routing requests to webhooks, regardless of that, there's still the API server layer of like which requests get routed to which webhooks. You can't reasonably test that in a meta webhook or a network layer unless you're going to re-implement that selection logic. So I think it's reasonable that people should be able to test that selection logic somehow.
We have this in webhook emission in the core infrastructure, which is we wait for the intervals. This is the config propagation problem to some degree. And we have service readiness for pod readiness gates and stuff. So I guess I'd be looking at those for inspiration and looking for the commonalities. And it sounds, to undo some of my poo-pooing, I was very specifically reacting to metrics, but gating of readiness of the things so that you can determine it makes everybody's life easier. We have a bunch of hacks in how the actual webhook admission plugin is implemented that work around the config propagation problem anyway on the server side of it. And then if you're looking at 3 API servers, you have that problem in threefold. So we already kind of have this, how do I make sure that the config is propagated so that I can say something interesting about whether it's working?
Okay, so this is a good discussion. I think we're rolling up on time. What are our next steps? Tim, do you have time and inclination to write up a KEP with some of these ideas, or what do we do next?
I would be happy to collaborate on a KEP. I do not have cycles in the next, say, in the 123 timeframe to drive this. So yeah, I wanted to share my use cases, and I'd be happy to see someone pick this up, but I'm afraid I can't drive it.
Okay. All right. Are there any other volunteers?
I was just gonna say, I think we're interested enough that if somebody else wanted to write a KEP, I'd look at that too, but I also cannot volunteer to drive it forward.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same.
I would make time to review a KEP though. Yeah. Review it, not guarantee a merge.
I can float this around my org a bit and see if I can find anyone who's interested in picking this up.
All right, so I think let's record this as it was a good discussion. We'll play it back for whoever's next interested, and yeah, volunteers are welcome. It might be complicated. Yeah. All right. Mike, would you like to? It looks like you dropped something on. Would you like to?
Yes. I'm getting interested in edge scenarios where it's critical in some cases to minimize the amount of stuff on the edge nodes. And I'm thinking from a kube point of view, the simplest approach is for an edge node to just be a worker node, not a one node cluster. And so I was thinking through what goes wrong there. And you can do a simple experiment, right? You can configure the cluster to tolerate the node being disconnected for a while. That kind of works. The fundamental thing is, we have this advocacy of doing level-based control rather than edge-based. And as long as you're doing level-based control and the things running on the node are doing level-based control, it should all work. The problem comes when you do something that's not level-based control. So for example, if you've got some pod that uses the API server to store a log of interesting events, for example, that's not edge-based. That's not level-based control. That's edge-based. And it seems to me that in fact the logical cases for where you want edge-based stuff really is logs. You know, maybe if we had some kind of generic support for logging that supports disconnected operation, and it might not even have to be in tree. Although I will note that kubelet does send events. So maybe we want something in tree, but you know, maybe it's definitely about supporting stuff that's not in tree as well as the kubelet and events. You know, we could have something that tolerates disconnection, and life would be good.
Clarifying question: when you said configure the cluster, I'm assuming you were talking about the
The node health controller.
Yeah, the node health, and that will kill all the pods if the node is gone, and turning that off or significantly lengthening the time period.
Right. Actually, I just remember there's another issue too, which is you don't really just want to make that a long time, right? What you really want to do is say, okay, you know, I semantically positively want to tolerate disconnection, but once it's connected, I actually do want to hear from the node. So there's actually another part of the problem here.
Okay, yeah. So you make the controller bimodal.
Something like that.
Just so I make sure I understand, because Dan, you said something I didn't expect. So the node termination controller only deletes after the node is physically deleted. Pods that tolerate disruption via the pod toleration can tolerate, the controller should ignore them up to completely arbitrary intervals and not reschedule them. That is a completely pod workload controllable input. So pod
it's completely possible that I have old state on that.
Yeah, so Mike, just verifying it, or you're talking about pods that have the tolerate node unready condition with a time frame that is very high, like hours, or are you talking about?
Sorry, sorry. I wasn't even aware of what you're talking about. Is there something that makes pods sensitive to nodes being
that
disconnected?
You can tolerate the node not ready condition, and tolerating the node not ready condition, or taint, sorry, should allow you to avoid the getting deleted off of a node behavior.
Okay. Right. Yeah. I think what I'm trying to say is the most direct approach is to not make the node go not ready. I mean, the node, yeah, I mean, I guess this is a valid question. Do we want to make the cluster kind of aware of the node's disconnection as an okay state, or it's just it's ready, everything's fine, it just hasn't checked in a long time?
So you want to change the lease interval on a node, but then when you bump the amount of disconnection you tolerate, you don't want to lose the rapid uptick when it does come back, because that is something that would be a SIG node kind of ask. Like, we want to we want to tolerate lease disruption for a long time, but then when it comes back, we want to rapidly bring it back in, because the lease there's like bimodal, as Dan was saying, on two sides of the lease.
Right. Well, there's multiple issues here, and I'm just exploring. So the thing that I was thinking when I put something on the agenda here was, apart from all this maintenance issue, there's a semantic issue, which is, you know, as you're one of the KCP people, right? So one of the you know, I very much agree with the first observation in KCP, which is the kube control plane is, you know, a great way to build distributed systems in general. And I've been doing that and having great fun and want to do more of that. But I want to tolerate a node being disconnected. But if I've got an app running on the node in a pod while it's disconnected, you know, what goes wrong? If it's a level-based app, everything's fine. It'll learn about new levels coming in from the outside world when it reconnects, and it can report the current level when it reconnects. Everything's fine for level-based logic running on the node in apps on the node. The problem is when you have an app on the node that is doing something that is edge-based, and it needs to report or do something on an edge, you know, it can't do that while it's disconnected.
So you have an app that is reporting something, not to something deployed for the app's purpose of reporting, but it's actually reporting via the Kube API server for some purpose.
Right. Yeah, I mean, imagine something that's doing some kind of compliance checking on the node, and any violation, it wants to post a notification to something that's listening to notifications. And it might do that through an API object.
Why wouldn't we expect such apps to keep track of their local state and manage distributing that knowledge when they reconnect at an app level? Why would we try to?
No, that is what I'm doing. That's the direction I'm going. Okay. And I'm thinking about, so as I think through that, right, there's basically two cases. One is the app reports its state. It's a state-based app. It's a level-based app. Okay. And in that case, it just works. We're done. Okay. The other case where we're not done is when the app needs to notify somebody or log something. That's where we run into trouble, because it can't for now. It has to queue those up, buffer those up, and deliver them once reconnection happens.
Are you proposing a way to change that? Maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're.
Yeah, so Mike, I kind of it was funny because like we've had a number of discussions in a couple forums on how the kube node could make temporary disruption from API servers more amenable to kubelets, and the workloads or the supporting infrastructure on the node that's required. So like the networking, kubeproxy, et cetera, where you could imagine a local API server or something like that. That's really not workload centric. That's about letting someone write a CSI driver that tolerates disruption of the node. That would be kind of a different class of problem than maybe what, I can't tell whether you're asking, you want your app workload to leverage an infrastructure like that, or do you want your app workload to be not impacted by that, and you view it as Kube's job, or it could potentially be Kube's job to help you mediate that?
I was thinking about the case of an app that has the need to, do something in response to an edge. Basically has the need to log something. That's the kind of scenario that occurred to me. And so I was thinking that, the API servers that we have, they're great for doing state-based stuff, right, by design, and not edge-based stuff. Logging is in some sense an edge-based thing. It's about just accumulating these log entries. So, if thinking about Kube as an application infrastructure, right, and I'm motivated to think about this because I know the kubelet logs events, right, creates events as basically a means of logging, right? So that's why I'm tangling it up with Kube. And maybe I just shouldn't. Maybe the fact of the matter is kubelet never logs anything while disconnected, in which case maybe we're completely done and it's not Kube's problem at all. But if maybe it is Kube's problem to support things that want to log stuff while disconnected.
Yeah, I'd probably say what you described as kind of the, while disconnected from an API server, the ecosystem of kube-like things on the node could do things that then tolerate disruption, which is one cap. And then the other is, I want to use that in a general purpose sense, which is a completely different cap.
So you'd be kind of looking for a, somebody's making noise.
Getting horrible echo, and I was hoping to get some clarification. I'm not sure I understand the distinction.
We can just take this to the Slack channel. I don't think this has to be.
Okay, thank you. And we're out of time anyway.
Yeah, we are on time. I hate to cut the discussion, but we need to respect the boundaries. Okay, I hope we can continue the discussion either next session or Slack. We'll upload this later today. Thank you everybody for joining. I hope everybody stays safe, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.